You couldn't hear anymore. The artillery bombardment had been going on for 3 hours straight, and somewhere around hour 2, your eardrums had given up. Now there was just a constant ringing and the feeling of pressure, like your head was being squeezed in a vice. You were crouched in a trench that was more mud than earth, water up to your knees, surrounded by 30 other men who looked as terrified as you felt. The man next to you was praying. The one on your other side was crying silently, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on his face. You were 19 years old and you'd been on the front lines of World War I for 6 weeks. 6 weeks that felt like 6 years. You'd already seen more death than you thought possible. Watched men get blown apart by shells. Watched them drown in mud. Watched them die slowly from wounds no one could treat. And now you waited for the whistle, the signal that would send you over the top, out of the relative safety of the trench and into no man's land where German machine guns waited to cut you down. You didn't want to go. Every fiber of your being screamed at you to stay in the trench, to refuse to run. But you knew what happened to men who refused. They were shot by their own officers, executed for cowardice. So you'd go. You'd climb that ladder when the whistle blew. You'd run toward the enemy lines knowing you'd probably die before you got 50 feet. This was war, not the glorious adventure the recruiting posters had promised, not serving your country with honor. Just waiting in mud and shit and blood for your turn to die, and knowing that your death would mean nothing, that the land you died trying to capture would be lost again tomorrow, that the war would continue long after you were rotting in a mass grave, that your life was worth exactly as much as the generals sitting in comfortable headquarters 20 miles back decided it was worth, which was nothing at all. World War I, from 1914 to 1918, saw soldiers experience conditions of unimaginable brutality on the Western Front. The war was characterized by trench warfare, a static, grinding form of combat where armies faced each other across narrow strips of devastated land called no man's land. Soldiers lived in trenches, long ditches dug into the earth that filled with water, mud, and waste. They slept in these trenches, ate in them, relieved themselves in them, died in them. The trenches were infested with rats that fed on corpses and human waste. Lice were universal. Every soldier had them, crawling through hair and clothes, spreading disease. Trench foot was common, a condition where feet rotted from constant exposure to cold, wet conditions. In severe cases, toes turned black and fell off. The smell was overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, latrines, decomposing corpses in no man's land that couldn't be retrieved. Gas attacks added chlorine and mustard gas to the mix, and through it all, the constant threat of death, from artillery shells that could land at any moment, from sniper fire if you raised your head above the parapet, from disease, from the sheer stress that broke men's minds. Soldiers weren't heroes. They were victims, trapped in a system that fed them into meat grinders and called it strategy. Private Thomas Henley was 19 when he was sent to the Western Front in France in 1916. He'd enlisted 6 months earlier, swept up in patriotic fervor and recruiting drives that promised adventure and glory. He'd been given minimal training. How to march, how to fire a rifle, basic discipline. Then he was shipped to France and thrust into hell. His first day in the trenches, Thomas watched a man's head explode. A sniper had caught him. The man had stood up just a bit too high to look over the trench wall. One moment he was there. The next moment everything above his shoulders was just gone. His body stood for a second, then crumpled. Blood sprayed everywhere. Thomas vomited. An older soldier told him he'd get used to it. Thomas didn't believe him, but within a week he'd seen so much death that he stopped reacting. You had to. If you let yourself feel everything, you'd go insane. So you shut down, became numb. Stopped seeing the dead as people and started seeing them as objects, bodies, meat. Things that needed to be moved or buried or just ignored. It was the only way to survive with your sanity remotely intact. Life in the trenches was a routine of boredom punctuated by moments of absolute terror. You'd spend hours doing nothing, standing in mud, trying to stay warm, picking lice off your body. Then suddenly artillery would start. Shells screaming overhead, exploding all around you. The ground would shake. Dirt and debris would rain down. Men would die torn apart by shrapnel or buried alive when trenches collapsed. Then it would stop, and you go back to waiting for the next bombardment, waiting for the order to attack, waiting to die. Thomas couldn't sleep. The fear kept him awake. And when he did sleep, he had nightmares, dreamed about drowning in mud, about being buried alive, about watching his friends die over and over. He woke up screaming more than once. The other soldiers understood. Everyone had nightmares. Everyone was terrified. You just didn't talk about it. Showing fear was weakness, and weakness could get you shot by your own side for cowardice. You pretended, acted brave, told jokes, wrote letters home saying everything was fine, all while knowing that any day could be your last. The attacks were the worst. When the whistle blew and you had to climb out of the trench and charge across no man's land toward enemy lines. No man's land was a wasteland, a strip of land hundreds of yards wide, completely destroyed by artillery. No vegetation, just mud, craters, barbed wire, and corpses. Thousands of corpses in various states of decomposition. You had to run across this while enemy machine guns fired at you. The sound was constant, bullets snapping past, men screaming, shells exploding. Thomas participated in his first attack in his third week. The order came at dawn: fix bayonets, prepare to advance. The whistle blew. Thomas climbed the ladder, his legs shaking so badly he could barely stand. He went over the top with hundreds of other men. Immediately, machine gun fire tore through the ranks. Men fell around him like wheat being cut. Thomas ran. He didn't aim toward the enemy lines. He just ran, trying not to die. The man next to him took a bullet to the chest and went down. Another man stepped on a mine and disappeared in a spray of red mist. Thomas made it maybe 50 yards before diving into a shell crater for cover. He lay there, half submerged in mud and water while bullets cracked overhead. He could see bodies everywhere, some moving, crying for help, most still. After an hour, the attack was called off. The survivors crawled back to their own lines. Thomas made it back. Out of his company of 200 men, 76 returned. 124 dead or wounded in a single attack that gained them nothing. Not an inch of ground. Just corpses in no man's land. If you were Thomas, 19 years old and watching over half your company die in an hour for no strategic gain, knowing you'd have to do it again tomorrow or next week, how would you have kept yourself from breaking completely? What would you have told yourself to justify continuing? Disease and environmental conditions killed as many soldiers as enemy action. Trench fever, spread by lice, caused high fever and severe pain. Dysentery was constant from contaminated water and food. Respiratory infections from gas attacks and the damp conditions. Trench foot could lead to gangrene and amputation. Thomas developed trench foot in his second month. His boots had been wet for weeks. He couldn't take them off because he might not get them back on. His feet started to hurt. Then the skin started to break down. By the time he got medical attention, his feet were rotting. A doctor told him he was lucky. They wouldn't have to amputate yet, but his feet were permanently damaged. Walking was painful. Running was agony. But he was sent back to the front line because he could still hold a rifle. That's all that mattered. Whether you could still fight, whether you were still useful. The moment you weren't, you were discarded, sent home if you were lucky, left to die if you weren't. But here's what makes the soldiers' experience in World War I even more horrific. The war was pointless. It started over an assassination and spiraled into a conflict that killed 17 million people and accomplished nothing except setting the stage for an even worse war 20 years later. The soldiers knew this. They could see that the attacks gained nothing, that thousands of men died to capture a few hundred yards of ground that would be lost the next day, that the generals ordering the attacks were incompetent, using outdated tactics against modern weapons, cavalry charges against machine guns, infantry assaults across open ground against entrenched positions, strategies that guaranteed massive casualties for no gain, and the soldiers had no choice but to follow these orders. Refusing meant execution. Deserting meant being hunted down and shot. You were trapped, forced to participate in your own destruction for causes that made no sense and leaders who saw you as expendable. The psychological weight of that knowledge broke men. Shell shock, what we now call PTSD, was epidemic. Men who couldn't stop shaking, who went catatonic, who lost their minds completely. The military response was often to execute them for cowardice or send them back to the front until they died. Mental health wasn't understood or valued. You were expected to function until you couldn't. Then you were discarded. Think about being forced to fight in a war you didn't understand for goals that made no sense, knowing that your commanders were sending you to die for nothing. Think about watching your friends die day after day while the war ground on with no end in sight. How long could you have survived that before your mind broke, before you stopped caring whether you lived or died? Most soldiers didn't survive the war intact. They were killed, wounded, or permanently damaged psychologically. Thomas lasted 18 months on the front. 18 months of constant fear, regular combat, watching friends die, living in conditions that slowly destroyed his body. He was hit by shrapnel during an artillery bombardment in his 16th month. A shell landed near his position. The blast threw him against the trench wall. Shrapnel tore through his right leg and abdomen. He was conscious, screaming, watching his blood soak into the mud. Other soldiers pulled him to a dressing station. A medic looked at his wounds and shook his head. Too severe. They could bandage him, but he needed surgery they couldn't provide here. Thomas was loaded onto a stretcher and taken to a field hospital several miles back. The journey took hours on rough roads. Every bump sent waves of agony through his torn body. He passed out several times, woke up to more pain. The field hospital was overwhelmed. Hundreds of wounded men, not enough doctors, not enough supplies. Thomas was triaged. His wounds were serious but not immediately fatal. He'd have to wait. He lay on a cot, his bandages already soaked with blood, while doctors worked on men they thought they could save. Thomas waited for 8 hours. By then, he'd lost too much blood. Infection had set in from the dirty shrapnel and the contaminated trench environment. When a surgeon finally looked at him, Thomas was going into shock. His body was shutting down. They tried to operate, but his blood pressure was too low. His heart stopped on the operating table. They tried to revive him. Failed. Thomas died at 20 years old. He'd survived 18 months of combat only to die from wounds that might have been treatable if he'd received care sooner. But there were too many wounded, not enough resources. Some people lived, some didn't. Thomas didn't. His body was buried in a military cemetery, one of thousands of identical white crosses. His family received a telegram. "Regret to inform you, Private Thomas Henley, killed in action." That was all. No details about how he died or where, just dead. One more casualty in a war that would consume millions. Thomas's parents grieved. His mother never recovered. She died 3 years after the war ended, people said, from a broken heart. His father lived another 20 years, but something in him had died with his son. Thomas's sacrifice meant nothing. The war ended. The lines barely moved from where they'd been when he died. The land he'd fought for changed hands multiple times. His death accomplished nothing strategic, nothing meaningful. It was just waste. The waste of a young life in a war that wasted an entire generation. The Great War destroyed millions of soldiers. Those who survived often came home broken, missing limbs, blind, scarred by gas, psychologically destroyed by things they couldn't talk about in a society that didn't want to hear. They were expected to just readjust. Go back to normal life. Get jobs, start families, pretend the war hadn't happened. Most couldn't. They struggled with nightmares, depression, survivor's guilt. Many ended up homeless, unable to function in civilian society. Some killed themselves. And 20 years later, the same nations did it again. World War II. Another generation of young men fed into the meat grinder, proving that nothing had been learned, that the sacrifice of Thomas and millions like him had taught humanity nothing. The war to end all wars ended nothing, changed nothing, just killed millions and set the stage for more killing. Thomas died believing he was serving his country, that his sacrifice meant something, that the war was necessary and noble, but it was. It was a catastrophic failure of leadership, diplomacy, and human decency that consumed an entire generation for no purpose. His death was meaningless, and that might be the cruelest truth of all, that he suffered and died for nothing. That his life was thrown away by leaders who saw soldiers as numbers on a board rather than human beings. That war doesn't create heroes, it creates victims, and then it erases them. Thomas is a name on a wall somewhere, one of millions. His story is forgotten, his suffering unrecorded beyond official casualties lists. He became a statistic, proof that war glorifies death while hiding the reality of what it does to human beings. The soldier's life isn't about honor or glory or service. It's about being used, being broken, being discarded. Thomas learned that. And he died with that knowledge. That's the real story of soldiers, not the myths we tell, but the brutal truth of young men sent to die for old men's mistakes. And we keep telling the myths, keep glorifying war, keep sending new generations of young men to learn the same lesson Thomas learned. That war is hell, that death is random and meaningless, that your life doesn't matter to the people giving orders, and that the only thing you die for is the person next to you because they're the only one who understands what you're going through. Thomas died in 1917. Soldiers are dying the same way today. Different wars, different weapons, same waste, same sacrifice, same forgotten names, and the cycle continues.